Well, what a topic we have today. The Overton window has shifted an inch towards sanity, and the Tory party, the Conservatives, have done something for the first time in 6 months. Tory MP Richard Holden, well, he put forward a bill to be debated in the Houses of Parliament and hopefully passed that would outlaw cousin marriages. And Robert Jenrick stood at the dispatch box and he asked the Secretary of State for Justice, Shabana Mahmood, whether the Labour Party would be supporting this bill.
Cousin marriage has absolutely no place in Britain. The medical evidence is overwhelming. It significantly increases the risk of birth defects. And the moral case is clear. We see hundreds of exploitative marriages which ruin lives. Frankly, it should have been stamped out a long time ago. Will the Justice Secretary commit to ending this medieval practice which is rearing its head once again in modern Britain?
He'll know that there has been a recent Law Commission report on marriage law more generally, and the government is going to consult on broader reform to marriage law, and we will certainly consider the issues that he's raised before setting out a public position.
Yes, you heard that right. Shabana Mahmood would not commit to Labour supporting the bill that would outlaw cousin marriage in the UK. And we'll come back to her in a short while. But first, can we just say a quick prayer for the Conservative Party who failed to elect Robert Jenrick as their party leader? When he stood at the dispatch box and gave that speech, I was just thinking to myself, well, first of all, I was thinking, why didn't you have any of this about you when you were actually in government? So I'm not laying too much praise on the Tories, but there's a guy that could actually threaten reform, not Olukemi Badenoch. Okay, so look, given that there's a law being introduced, obviously there is a problem that needs to be solved. And if there's a problem that needs to be solved, we can infer from that that there are people in Britain who are marrying their cousins. But who is it? Because I don't know anyone who's married their cousin, and you probably don't either. Now the answer can probably get you cancelled, but the answer is that it's the British Pakistani community. In particular, Pakistanis who hail from the Kashmir region of Pakistan. Now, if you don't believe me that that's true, here's a BBC article from 2023, so just 1 year ago, celebrating the fact that cousin marriages in British Pakistani couples have fallen to just 46%. So that, apparently, is a reason for celebration. So it really is just one small group that's doing it. Now, for balance, I also found somewhere that 1% of white British people are married to either first or second cousins. And that shocked me, that really shocked me. So let me just take the time to tell you that you are also a wrong'un. That's very, very strange behaviour. But nevertheless, 46%, it really is an issue with just one group. Those are just the statistics, that's just the data, it doesn't lie. Now we come back to Shabana Mahmood. Where does she come from? Well, her parents grew up and lived in the Kashmir region of Pakistan. So of course, this is a really difficult issue for the Tories to press her on because they're effectively asking her to deny her own culture. I think the ethical argument against this is pretty clear, right? It's just obviously wrong. Prima facie, at first sight, this is just obviously wrong. But the ethical argument is compounded even further by the medical argument. Children born to these kinds of marriages, cousin marriages, have double the likelihood of having some kind of genetic defect at birth. In fact, this problem is so bad that 30% of children who are born with autosomal recessive disorders, and I don't claim to fully understand exactly what that means, but 30% of children with those disorders are born to British Pakistani couples in the UK. That is a shocking statistic. For reference, there are only 4% of births in this country to Pakistani couples, and they make up just 2% of the population anyway. So 2% of the population are producing 30% of the birth defects in this country. That's absolutely harrowing. And look, it's really costly, as well as obviously being devastating for those children, and quite frankly, for the families. I'm sure it's not nice for the parents. But it's also really expensive for the NHS. Some of these more severe conditions that can come about can cost the NHS up to £300,000 every year in care costs. And of course, the lives of those children will be not optimal and probably vastly shortened. It's a really horrible, unfortunate situation. Ethically, medically, it's just not good. It's really terrible. Now, there's something I want to add to that last statistic that I just gave. I found that statistic in a research paper by the NIH, and it makes very clear that it's not always just about cousin marriage. In fact, for a lot of the people who are giving birth to children with these autosomal recessive disorders, they're not actually married to their cousins first or second. It's because they have such a small gene pool to pick from that they actually have the same ancestors, but they just don't realise it. So in that case, that's actually quite difficult. That's really not their fault, and there's not a great deal that they can do about it other than genetic testing, which I'll come on to later. Now, there's one more thing that I want to consider. And look, I'm not justifying anyone marrying their cousin. I just want to make very clear, I think it's absolutely abhorrent. But we have to consider this fact. Do you believe, genuinely, that in these communities, in these small communities, 46% of people are falling in love with their cousins and marrying them? Statistically, what are the odds of that? That's extremely unlikely. And so I think these cousin marriages are actually a symptom of another underlying cause that needs to be tackled. And that underlying cause is the arranged marriages. Parents choosing who you marry. Now, in that culture, it's seen as a good thing to keep it in the family and build strong family ties. And so the parents will choose people that are within their own family for you to marry. I suspect a lot of young British Pakistani people in this country aren't actually going into those relationships in love at all. They're being selected for them. They may even, I have no idea, they may even be pretty grossed out by the idea of marrying their cousin, but that's the tradition in their family. That's what they do. So there is an underlying cause there, I'm pretty sure. It just doesn't make sense to me. It used to be 60%. It doesn't make sense to me that 60% of people just happen to fall in love with and marry their first cousins. Come on. Anyway, you would probably imagine that this bill is going to pass unanimously. Who in Parliament is going to stand against a bill like this? Well, unfortunately, there is a man. He's an independent MP called Iqbal Mohammed, and I'll play you the clip here of him in Parliament and exactly what he has to say on this topic.
The way to redress this is not to empower the state to ban adults from marrying each other, not least because I don't think it would be effective or enforceable. Instead, the matter needs to be approached as a health awareness issue and a cultural issue where women are being forced against their will to undergo marriage. An estimated 35 to 50% of all sub-Saharan African populations either prefer or accept cousin marriages, and it is extremely common in the Middle East and in South Asia. The reason the practice is so common is that ordinary people see family intermarriage overall as something that is very positive, something that helps build family bonds and helps put families on a more secure financial foothold. However, as is well documented, it is not without health risks for the children of those relationships, some of whom will be born out of wedlock. Instead of stigmatizing those who are in cousin marriages or those inclined to be, a much more positive approach would be to facilitate advanced genetic test screening for prospective married couples, as is the case in all Arab countries in the Persian Gulf, and more generally to run health education programs targeting those communities where the practice is most common. I would therefore urge the House to vote against this motion and to find a more positive approach to addressing the issues that are caused by first cousin marriages, including the health risks.
Now, Iqbal has taken quite a lot of flack, which I fully understand, because he is standing in Parliament and saying that we shouldn't put in a bill to criminalise cousin marriages. But Iqbal does have some points that are actually quite interesting to consider. He brings up the issue that I just mentioned, which I did think of independently of Iqbal, I should stress, of arranged marriages. But he also brings up a point that culturally, this is simply not going to change, and it's going to be impossible to police and enforce, even if you change the law. Now, I don't think that that is a good reason in itself not to change the law. Something being difficult to police doesn't mean that it shouldn't be in the law if it's objectively, morally, the right thing to have in law. Another thing that Iqbal suggests is that we should focus on this not as a moral issue, but as a health issue. And unfortunately, Iqbal, you're wrong. It's both. It's a moral issue and it's a health issue. It's both. And the health issue just makes the moral issue even more significant. Iqbal argues that we should focus instead of not stigmatizing this practice. Well, I disagree. I think we should be stigmatizing this practice, but he thinks we shouldn't. And he thinks that we should instead focus on genetic screening so that when couples, I guess before they're married, take genetic tests to work out if there are going to be problems. Now look, that would solve some of the health situation, I'm sure. But again, it speaks to an underlying problem. If you fall in love with someone, what's a genetic test going to do to make you fall out of love with them? But of course, nothing, because they're not in love with each other. All of these marriages are arranged. And the reality is as simple as this. This is not British culture, okay? I will come back to it because in the past, people have married their cousins in Britain, and I'll talk about that later. But this is not modern British culture, okay? We should not be bending over backwards to fit in an absolutely abhorrent practice of people marrying their cousins. We should not be putting another burden on the NHS of genetic screening so that we can, keep this part of Kashmiri culture alive in Britain. Absolutely not. And this is where you run into a big problem. Now, because of multiculturalism and this idea that all cultures are equal, and all cultures are equally valid, you've got the lefties desperately trying to protect this idea that cousin marriage is somehow okay. It's just a part of a different culture and we need to accept it. There's a doctor who I was speaking to on X, and he describes himself as a medical doctor, ethicist and philosopher. Okay, that's how he describes himself. I asked him 3 times the very simple question of whether he would support a bill that would outlaw cousin marriage in the UK. And he wouldn't answer me. He just said, oh, it's being used to stigmatize minority ethnic groups, blah, 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 blah. He would not answer the very simple question. This is the problem with multiculturalism. You are now getting wrapped around the axle, defending things that you know are morally abhorrent. And the situation's only going to get worse. The more that we bring in other cultures to the UK, the more problems that you're going to find. Things that you know deep down are completely opposed to our way of life, that you're left somehow trying to defend. That's the curse of the leftist position. Now, one last point I'll make about Iqbal's speech. He talked about cultural change, about how we need to try and change slowly the culture of people from the Kashmir province of Pakistan, and just Pakistan more generally. And that's his proposed solution. But that's never going to work, and I'll tell you why. Because the imams rule the culture in those small communities. The imams are like the Islamic priests, the preachers. And the imams are never going to come out and say cousin marriage is wrong. And here's why. Because Muhammad, his 7th wife, was his first cousin. So those imams can't come out and say cousin marriage is wrong because they'd be defying something that the Prophet Muhammad did. And they see the Prophet Muhammad as the perfect man. It's very deeply entrenched in that culture. And there's really nothing that the imams are going to do. They're not going to revolutionize and modernize and come into modern society. We know that. We see that. Okay. The only way that you would have that cultural change in reality is if people strayed away from the teachings of Islam within those communities, which again is probably not going to happen. One thing that I can think of that could bring about this cultural change is a very simple amendment to the bill that's going through now. And it states that not only is cousin marriage illegal in this country, but if you are married to your cousin, say you go to Pakistan, so you try and bypass this law, you marry your cousin in Pakistan and then come back to the UK. Well, if you do that and your child is born with a genetic defect, you cannot claim anything from the NHS for that child. So suddenly you are now faced with the prospect of a £300,000 a year NHS bill for having, or medical bill, because it wouldn't be the NHS. You are faced with the cost of that. And that I think would start to reshape the culture and bring people away from marrying and shagging their cousins, or at least I hope it would. I think that's quite a simple thing to do. A lot of people will say, well, that's cruel, think about the child. Well, if you implement this process, you will have far fewer of those children. So I think that's ethically a good thing, but I'm sure some people will find a way to call me a monster for depriving healthcare to children of cousin marriages. You do you. Argue about it in the comments. Now, I'm going to preempt a criticism here against what I'm saying, that this is against British values. And people are going to say, well, historically, people in Britain have married their cousins. And those people are right. Charles Darwin married his first cousin. Queen Victoria, 1 year later in 1840, well, she also married her first cousin. In fact, in nobility, this happens quite a lot. And actually, as a result of that inbreeding, a lot of those people had conditions. Their children were born with disabilities because they kept marrying their cousins to try and keep everything a bit more, noble and royal and keep that royal blood. Not good. My answer is very simple. All of that stuff is also bad and ethically wrong. People probably just didn't really realize the health consequences at that time. They actually genuinely believed, mistakenly, that they were preserving royal blood and keeping noble family lines and all that good stuff. But yeah, it's still wrong to be marrying your cousin. I'm sorry, it's just that simple. So look, it's as fairly straightforward as that. Yes, people in the past have done this in Britain, and yes, they were also wrong-uns. Sorry, Charles Darwin. It is what it is. So let me know what you make of all of this. I'm really curious, especially on this topic, to see some of the comments I get. Maybe some people will be calling me a wrong-un because I said it's not all their fault, but partly their parents' fault as well for arranging the marriages. Look, all I would say is try and keep your comments like a little bit PG, or be very careful how you curate them and write them, because certain keywords and certain things will just get YouTube to immediately delete the comment. Like, I won't even see it. And I've seen a lot of people saying, oh, where did my comment go? And I can't even find it. So I guess YouTube, depending on what you say, will just completely delete the comment. Now, look, I just want to say thank you as well to everyone who supported on the last video. It's funny, I was complaining that I couldn't get a video past 400 views. As soon as I complained, maybe the YouTube algorithm heard me and it's got like 5,500 views or whatever. So that's very, very cool. I still have some comments to reply to on that video, which I of course will do in good time. And yeah, if you reply to this video, I will also reply to your comment. Peace, till the next one.